Hi, I'm Bob Rae. I'm the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations. I'm speaking to you from the Lester Pearson room in the Canadian mission. And I have the great honor of speaking today with Stephen Schlesinger, who's the author of Active Creation, which still remains the standard classic account of how the UN was formed, how it was created, and what it means to the world today. But I think the title itself says it. It was an active creation, a deliberate decision by a group of people. And so it's a great pleasure to have Stephen with us today. And we look forward to a good conversation and a good chat. Stephen.
Thank you, Ambassador. I am the author of Active Creation. I'm here as a fellow at the Century Foundation in New York City, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about the book. It's the 20th anniversary of the book, so I'm kind of excited about that.
Well, you should be, because it is a great book, and I've told many people, my staff, new people coming in. As you know, diplomacy is like a 4-year assignment, so we have people coming in all the time, and people unfortunately leaving. And I always tell them, background reading, you want to get into understanding the history of this institution. It's very important to read your book, because it still remains a standard account. And I think it's, you're to be congratulated for it, and congratulations on the 20th anniversary. I wanted to start, Stephen, if I could, by talking a little bit about the background to the background. The active creation didn't take place in a vacuum. Obviously, it was the product of the Second World War, of all the circumstances there. But I'd like you to give us a bit of the things that the American administration or in the United States' experience, which led the president to President Roosevelt to decide that this was going to be a critical initiative that he attached a great deal of importance to, and he was willing to press ahead. Because there were some difficult precedents in the past that would lead perhaps many others to say, let's not be too ambitious. But perhaps you can just give us a bit of that background.
Yeah, I think the role of President Roosevelt was absolutely crucial. He was kind of born into internationalism. He'd spent a lot of time in Europe, obviously from a wealthy family. But when he was working in President Wilson's administration, Wilson, of course, had endorsed the League of Nations as a new kind of worldwide security body. And Roosevelt was very invested in the League of Nations. He was the vice presidential candidate in 1920, and he went around the country promoting it. And he was he thought that it was so important to have an international body that would bring together all the nations of the world and prevent the outbreak of war. Of course, it was defeated by the U.S. Senate, and this was a great blow not only to Wilson but to Roosevelt himself. He never forgot that. And so when the U.S. was facing the possibility of the outbreak of war in Europe in the late 1930s, Roosevelt started thinking, we've got to resurrect the League of Nations, but it has to be a body that is not flawed the way the League was. In the League, every nation had the veto, which meant a rogue nation could veto any mission by the League, and therefore it, in a sense, rendered it ineffectual as a proactivist body. And so Roosevelt had to figure out ways of resurrecting the similar organization, but without that special flaw where every nation had the veto. And in addition, the U.S. at that time was very isolationist, so he had to figure out a way of doing it without creating a controversy within the country who would hit the idea of a new organization the way they hit it back with the League of Nations. So he secretly instructed the U.S. State Department to start working on the outlines of a new covenant for a new organization, based in many ways on the League, but he brought together a more realistic understanding of the power realities of that time in a way that would make sure that the U.S. did join it. Because one of the objections by the U.S. Senate back in 1920s was that they thought it it invaded our sovereignty too
Right,
much.
right.
And so we had to therefore protect the US in the future. And so that's why he developed the idea that only 5 nations should have the veto power. Because he knew that without that veto power, the proposal for a United Nations would never be passed by the US Senate. And if the US Senate didn't pass it, and the US never joined it, as had happened with the League, it would basically hollow out the organization and make it ineffective. And by the way, at the same time, the Soviets insisted that they have the veto, and if they didn't join, as true of the US, then again the US, the organization would have been bankrupt as far as its ability to have any influence on the rest of the world. So you had those 2 nations being absolutely critical to the creation of the UN, and it meant that at San Francisco, the meeting in 1945 that basically drafted the UN Charter, that the US presented a plan which only 5 nations would have the veto, and this very much upset the rest of the rest of the nations there, and they fought very hard at the US at the San Francisco meeting to make sure that they in themselves also got the veto. But what happened was, in the end, the US and the Soviet Union said, listen, if you try to break our hold on the Security Council, where those vetoes would have the biggest impact, that if you insisted we either expand the veto or abolish it, we're going to walk out.
Right. That was the condition, a precondition.
Precondition.
And it came out of the experience that President Roosevelt had, and obviously the Russians said, well, if you're going to get one, we're going to get one. And I think you've identified right away the tension in the organization that we feel today between the Security Council and the General Assembly. And now we've gone from a General Assembly of 53 members to a General Assembly of 193 members. And this sense of a who is in charge and how that gets balanced out and how we find solutions to this is quite fundamental to some of the debates that we're having now. How do we limit the use of the veto? How do other countries get a veto? And UN reform, that's one of the issues that's key. Just want to go back to one other tension that I see between human rights and the promotion of democracy and the democratic ideal, which is very much in the Charter, and the idea that national sovereignty must be respected and that nation states are self-determining, and again, a tension that we see today between the ideals of the rule of law, the ideals of trying to increase and promote democracy. My sense is this was something that Roosevelt really explored with Churchill in the Atlantic Charter, where he was saying to the British, if you want us, we're not going to come with, we're going to protect your empire. We're going to come with other ideals about self-determination, much as Wilson did when he released his 14 points. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to pursue successfully the 14 points at Versailles. But I think this is something that's still playing out here at the UN.
I agree with you. As you point out, in 1941, the Atlantic Charter was signed between Churchill and Roosevelt, and it promoted the idea of freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom from hunger. And those were the principles on which Roosevelt and Churchill were going to fight the Second World War. And it gave a kind of basis to the UN Charter. It's interesting, though, the UN Charter was basically a security-based organizational ideal. So Roosevelt was a realist about politics, about world politics. He believed that the UN should be a security body, and its principal focus was on preventing the outbreak of war. Therefore, when the conditions came for who should be admitted, he did not focus on whether a country was a human rights violator or a dictatorship. he focused on just getting the country into the organization on the theory that it was better to have them all there, whether they were democracies or not, because that might be the way that they could bring together resolutions that would be approved generally on the Security Council level in a way that enhanced the authority of the UN, but also made sure that it was based on the power realities of the time. Now, of course, in 1945, there were only 5 nations that were picked out: China, the United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. Ever since then, other nations over the last 7 to 8 years have emerged which are equal to the power of many of the nations that are now part of the 5 group. And therefore, every year we've had desire and efforts to reform the Security Council and either expand the veto power among other nations, I don't know, like Brazil or Japan or Germany, or countries that are, in a sense, grown powerful and rich and have the ability to help the UN in a way that the 5 principal countries who have the veto have always played a role. But at the same time, human rights was part of the idea that Roosevelt was addressing in the Atlantic Charter. His idea was, the realism was the Security Council. The idealism was the General Assembly. Because in the General Assembly, you have every nation a single vote. Doesn't matter if it's a small or impoverished nation or a big, strong one. It only has one vote.
Right.
So that reflected the idea that every nation should have a role of some authority in the United Nations. Otherwise, what's the point of joining the organization? But that created, as you point out, the imbalance or balance between the General Assembly and the Security Council. The Security Council based on power realities, the General Assembly based on idealistic notion that every nation should participate. That has never been resolved. There's always a constant conflict between the 2 entities. And I think that until there's reform in the Security Council, I think that's going to continue.
Yeah, I think when we looked at I think you've described well what Roosevelt was thinking about, but also what the Russians were thinking about at the time, and I think you've quite rightly pointed out that in the debate and in San Francisco and the difficult process of negotiation, although it all happened very quickly, you have to say. I mean, they got it done in a remarkably short period of time to get it underway. And the final thing that I think that is interesting is Roosevelt's political skill in understanding that he had to get the senators in by making them part of the delegation of the United States to the, and so you had key Republican and Democratic senators who were there making a huge difference in saying, and he was smart the way Roosevelt did it. I mean, he's a brilliant politician. The way he said, okay, we got them there, now let them start to take ownership of this thing.
Exactly. And
let them see that there's some things that they've been calling for that are now in the document. Like a lot of the comments about rule of law, about other elements in the document that are very important to us today, were put there by senators.
This is true.
Who very much wanted to put forward that concept of how the organization should unfold. And that's what led them to champion quick and speedy ratification of the charter in 1945. It all happened within the space of a few months.
This is true, and one of the leading Republicans was Arthur VandenBerg, the senator from Michigan, who had been a great isolationist. But Roosevelt was shrewd enough to bring him on the mission, the U.S. mission to the San Francisco conference, so they had an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. That was something that Wilson didn't do.
Yeah.
Wilson sent a mission to Versailles, which is all Democrats. And that meant that the Republicans had no investment in the outcome of the League of Nations charter. And so, yes, once VandenBerg and his Republican colleagues thought that they had actually participated in the design of the UN, they were willing to go back and make the argument to the U.S. Senate that this was worthwhile joining. And of course, the crucial thing was the veto power. Once the U.S. designed the charter in such a way that we had the veto to basically mean that we would never have our sovereignty invaded unless we allowed it. That also pleased the Republicans. But crucial, as you say, was that the VandenBerg type isolationists came into this community of multilateralists and realized that they could actually have a role, and that made a critical difference to the outcome of the vote in the U.S. Senate about ratifying the treaty.
What's interesting as well is that although you say it was Roosevelt's vision that it would be essentially a security organization, I think that's true. It's also important to stress that the vision that they had, which was not perfectly realized in the charter or in subsequent to the charter, was the creation of an economic and social council, which would also have a role in advancing development, in advancing the interests of all the countries that were less developed than the most advanced economies, and how creating a new economic and social order had to be part of this process of democratic globalization, or I don't know exactly what you'd call it, but the vision that people had as to how things could go after 1945. We'll talk in a moment about how events overtake the institutions, and then institutions have to evolve to deal with all the events that follow afterwards. But that economic and social aspect is also a critical part of the structure of the charter itself.
No, I think there's no question that the designers of the UN said, listen, where do wars start? Well, wars start because of economic imbalances, because of water rights, because of all sorts of issues that have nothing to do with security, except for the fact that they may impoverish one nation because they withhold water rights from another nation, or there's immigration issues, there's all sorts of internal dynamics on a domestic level that have to be dealt with really in that dealt with in the Economic and Social Council. It didn't always work. I mean, it was a idealistic notion that that was part of world security, and it helped, though. It helped the UN. The UN Charter, by the way, is a very flexible document.
It is.
And it's sort of like the U.S. Constitution. And out of the UN Charter have grown all these UN agencies which deal with, like United Nations Development Program, which deal with the economic issues and refugee issues and questions of regulation of air traffic and sea safety. So in that sense, beyond just the Economic and Social Council are all these other agencies which reflect the design of that Economic and Social Council, but in a more specific way. So the UN has become kind of the place of last resort when nations together realize they have common needs that have to be dealt with. Where do they go? They go to the UN to get some resolution.
That's right. I mean, I think I think your description of the charter as a flexible document is reflected in the reality that all of the institutions that we have created since 1945 may not have been specifically anticipated by the drafters.
That's right.
But the drafters had the vision to say, let's allow this to happen. Let's not create a structure that's frozen in time, where you only have these bodies and no other agencies and no other bodies that can be created. And I think that's part of, even though people get very frustrated with the UN and very frustrated with its inabilities to do things, we have given ourselves the capacity to do a better job and to learn from experience and to create new structures that I think has been, may not have been anticipated in every detail in 1945, but was certainly never ruled out.
Well, for example, peacekeeping.
Yeah.
I mean, that was never mentioned in the original document.
Security needs and the possibilities of intervention, but the methods by which they would intervene, that was very much Mr. Pearson's pictures.
I was going to say, Lester Pearson,
right.
your former prime minister, one time foreign minister who was at the San Francisco conference in 1945, won the Nobel Peace Prize for his design of the peacekeeping operation in Suez in 1956. And so, yes, it's very much, that's another strength of the UN, reinvention. They've been able to not only redesign the organizational charter, but draw from that charter all sorts of structures which reflect needs that are needs that the world wants. And I think Pearson played a crucial role in developing peacekeeping, which has been absolutely essential ever since for this organization. I mean, what do people remember about the UN mostly is peacekeeping.
Yeah. Well, it is peacekeeping, but something else too, because we talked about Franklin Roosevelt, but I want to turn our attention a little bit to the work of his wife, Elanor, because she was very strongly in favor of the creation of the UN. She was a major advocate, and as we all know, she had a tremendous role in the creation of the International Declaration and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we're now celebrating this year the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration. And I sort of see it as like parallel and similar in a way to how the Bill of Rights succeeded the Constitution. People saw the Constitution, they said, wait a minute, we haven't done enough to protect this. And so they didn't rule out doing it, so they allowed for the possibility. I think the Universal Declaration kind of clarified this whole dimension of human development as being a critical part of the new world order after 1945. And it was eventually passed unanimously by the General Assembly and accepted. But that itself has given rise to the High Commission on Human Rights, to the whole body of international law on human rights, which has been vastly strengthened and changed since 1945. Again, part of this key sense of the vision that was present at creation.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the 1948, when the Declaration on Universal Declaration on Human Rights was forged, and Elanor Roosevelt was the key figure in that conference, the feeling was the UN Charter had not really encompassed human rights in fulsome, in a way that extended to every nation on the globe. We talked about the fact that originally the UN was focused on security, but mentioned human rights almost as a side issue. So therefore, it was important that the organization build on the charter and have this 1948 conference on human rights to help amplify the vision as Roosevelt saw it, as Elanor Roosevelt saw it. And out of that charter, charter of a declaration of 1948 came the Human Rights Council and all the other human rights organizations, many of them independent of the UN, which kind of spun out of that meeting. So yes, I think that was a very critical step towards amplifying the vision of the UN for all communities around the world.
It's interesting too that you mentioned civil society and the role of human rights organizations and non-governmental organizations. Another innovation in San Francisco was the presence of hundreds of people who weren't states. And they were largely American, but not only American. And as you describe in your book, they actually had a major impact in going from the draft document to the document itself, looking at pressuring, without apology, pressuring for changes to be made, improvements to be made, and then campaigning for the document afterwards. But I think it's fair to say that prior to that, we never really thought of a collective body of civil society organizations having the impact that they had in 45. And now, of course, their impact here in New York and everywhere is huge. Their impact at the United Nations is huge. Also contested by some countries. Guess which ones? But it's a very important element in this thing.
It is, and I think that was part of Roosevelt's notion that it couldn't simply be the League of Nations kind of stood alone. It didn't really interact with the rest of humanity. And I think he felt from the beginning that it couldn't be a dynamic, ongoing, interactive organization without civil society being part of its development. And therefore he encouraged these very different entities on all sorts of different ethnic and civil rights and all the kinds of work of which we see today of these so-called non-governmental organizations. And he encouraged them to be there because he knew that that would nurture and fortify the strength of that document, the UN Charter. And so today, it's become normal for the UN to interact with civil societies. And it's grown in strength. There's now more of a business interaction with the UN than it was true of back in 1945 or even in the early years of the UN. That was a new development which came really in the last 10 or 20 years. Yes, I think that fortifies the UN, makes it more relevant to the lives of people, and means that societies feel we should support this organization. It's not an enemy to us, it's an ally to us.
Well, I think that's right, but I think it's also important to sort of, as I look at the dynamic today in the UN, the one that I found coming here 3 years ago, a lot of resistance. I mean, obviously from the Russians and the Chinese and other countries that don't have much participation, genuine free participation by civil organizations, but by many other nation states that say, we don't want to be scrutinized. We don't want so much attention being paid to what we're doing or not doing, and it's important, I think, for us to understand this dynamic that we're seeing at work here on the floor of the UN. The thing I've realized is that the Charter is very much a living document. It's referred to in debates. It's constantly quoted. Sometimes people will quote from one section and not remember to quote from another one because you have to pull it all together to get a sense of the structure of the document. The last thing I really want to go through with you is a little bit of the evolution after 1945, how the Cold War really began to change the dynamic in the UN. The Korean War being the first dramatic confrontation between the United Nations and a member state. And we're seeing this again today. The reason I raise it is because when we look at what's happening today, the decision of a member state to invade another member state, the Charter is very clear, that's a no-no, you can't do that. You have to refer it immediately, it has to be dealt with directly. And the Russians are the ones who've done it, and they're a permanent member, and they have the veto. Sometimes many people say to me, why do they have a veto? I explain to them the history. And then they say, well, why do they have it today? And I said, because they have it then. And taking away a veto, we can't take away the veto without the veto. In other words, the Russians can veto taking away the veto.
Absolutely.
So they protected themselves.
No, I think this is, the strength and bane of the UN. Roosevelt, as I've said earlier, was realistic about the power realities back in 1945. He wanted those 5 countries that I mentioned to work together. He figured that was the only way you were going to stamp out conflicts. But what if one of those nations that had the veto actually started a war? How do you deal with them? He didn't really have an answer for that. I mean, he just hoped that they would stick together, because they did during the war as allies, and in a way that would effectuate the mission of the UN to block out conflicts. So as the Cold War began, suddenly the UN was rendered somewhat ineffective, because anytime the US wanted to do something, at that point our rival, the Soviet Union, would block it with a veto, and vice versa. We would block efforts by the Russians to do something that we didn't like with the veto. So really, until the downfall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the only role the UN was able to play was peacekeeping, because that at least meant there was an agreement between the major powers that you needed to in place a UN group of soldiers or peacekeepers to prevent further outbreaks of war that neither power, either the Soviet Union or the U.S., wanted to happen. And so during those many years, well, probably about almost 60 years of that period until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the UN did play a vital role in providing not only negotiation and working out deals to prevent wars from spreading or at least happening in key countries, but also allowing these differing viewpoints to be debated as part of the organization's, in a sense, presence. So you had the Soviets and the US on the Security Council debating with each other. At least they were talking to each other in that sense. And China then became a member, and China also contributed to that dialogue that was necessary for peace to be kept. So the UN did still play a vital role, but since the end of the Soviet Union, the US and the UN, Russia started basically agreeing on resolutions. For example, the first Gulf War, the Russians supported a UN mission
Yes.
to oust the Iraqis from Kuwait. Yes, that did happen. So Roosevelt's vision was finally carried out, the five nations working together. Now we're back to what happened during the Cold War. You have Russia being the foe and the US being its opposite, and therefore the Russians have blocked any peace efforts in the Ukrainian crisis that might solve this bloody conflict. And we're back to a situation where the UN is in a way stymied by this. I mean, it can send out special emissaries, which I think is very important. It can come up with peace plans. It can try to negotiate in its own quiet way, but it can't play that key role of blocking or stamping out violence the way it was basically asked to do back in 1945.
I think one of the things that is also true, though, is that this was, in a sense, pretty much not anticipated exactly, but I mean the creation of regional organizations was anticipated, so the possibility of creating a regional alliance like NATO was something that was not outside the framework of the Charter, or outside the framework of international law. But I think we really need to think about more how the UN can still play a constructive role, notwithstanding the challenges of the veto, notwithstanding the challenges of power politics, which have, as you've described it, the UN was not born absent power politics. The UN was born out of power politics. So it's not as if the world of power politics is alien to the UN. It's all about how do we limit the impact of the abuse of power, and how do we limit the negative consequences of a conflict like we're seeing following the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And I think that's where the UN is still looking to where it can play a role. For example, the Secretary General played a key role in the Black Sea issue with respect to getting grain moving, until the Russians decided they were going to bomb Odessa anyway and say the hell with it. But the Secretary General can't change that, but he can have a role and an influence in trying to persuade people the logic of moving in a different direction.
Yeah, I think the Secretary General can play a key role in this kind of situation. After all, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, U Thant, who was then UN Secretary General, was a kind of intermediary between the Soviet Union and Washington, the US, to help settle that really extremely fearful and dangerous situation. And without the UN, I'm not sure where the two countries would have come together and figured out a solution. And so, yes, the UN can play the role. My only regret is that I'm all for the Secretary General. I just wish he'd been more proactive before the Russians invaded. But I can't always figure out why a Secretary General acts as they do. But the most important thing is that they act. That after all, is their role.
Right.
And to the extent that that Guterres, who's the UN Secretary General now, engineered that deal on the grain shipment was terrific, and also the UN has played a role in protecting the nuclear reactors
Right.
that are also a dangerous situation. Might have another Chernobyl if the UN had not been involved. And I think the UN still has the role to, once the two countries, Ukraine and Russia, realize that the fight is just at a point of stalemate, maybe at that point the UN can come in and say, hey, gentlemen, we can help you settle this. And I think they can provide the negotiation that can't be otherwise provided by any other entity.
Well, I mean, I think there is a role there. I think the critical thing too, though, is that the UN structure, including the ICC, including other institutions, I think have given a lot of clout to the idea of international law having a meaning and having an impact and needing to be enforced in ways that we haven't really seen since Nuremberg, and that I think is still a journey that we're going through as we try to figure out, what are the next steps to be taken in the context of this war. Stephen, I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you about this book, but also about the institution that you're describing. We live with it every day and its challenges, and it's really good to get this historical perspective on the work that we're doing.
Well, I just want to say that having written this book about the UN and how it was founded, I'm still an idealist. And when I walk into that UN building and see all the flags flying from 193 different nations, I'm stirred in my heart that this organization exists. And my God, where would we be without it?
Well, I always say to people who are its critics, I say, well, look, if we didn't have it, we'd have to invent another one. I mean, it's the same thing, so we might as well make this one as good as we can make it. That's, I think, the way we approach it. But it's great to be with you, and I want to thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you.
Well, thank you.
It's been great. Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.